that phrase, right? Gut feelings, gut instincts. I just feel it in my gut. I have butterflies in my stomach. Somehow our ancestors knew that our soul, our seed, the gut was the seat of the soul, that we somehow had this intuition, this sort of knowingness that was somehow in that part of our body, right? Now science is catching up with antiquity, that we have randomized controlled trials and we know the mechanisms of action as far as the scientific literature is concerned of how the gut is connected to the brain. And we cannot separate mental health from physical health, and how people can eat super clean, take the right supplements, do all the wellnessy stuff on a physiological level, but unresolved trauma and chronic stress and something that I call shameflammation, how are these things impacting our biochemistry? Because they're influencing our biochemistry just as much as food.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. As I'm sure you're aware, wellness is a multifaceted endeavor. Getting your mind right, your diet right, your body right, your soul right. It is a constant negotiation. It is an ever complexifying encryption algorithm that we all struggle to decode in the best of cases. And then, of course, inevitably an unplanned stressor hits. You're trying to be good, but you roll your ankle on the way to the co-op to get your green juice, or your cat gets a UTI, or an esoteric $2,000 part on your car explodes, or your $2,000 cat explodes. I went too far with that example. As a cat owner, I acknowledge that. Point being, good luck maintaining balance when that, or worse, happens. And that's why I am so grateful for people like Dr. Will Cole. This man has dedicated his life to the kind of multifaceted healing and wellness that all of us need through his books, his podcasts, and his clinical practice. He's the best-selling author of several books, including Intuitive Fasting, and his latest, Gut Feelings, in which he really unites the mind and body, health and mindfulness in a beautiful, practical way, among many other things. And in this mind meld, we get into just that, the illusion of separation between the body and mind, inflammation, the power of the mind, how social and spiritual unwellness can sometimes manifest as physical health issues, and much more. All the links you will need for Dr. Will Cole and all of his doings, his books, his podcasts, are in the description, as are the necessary keyboard mudras for Third Eye Drops. On that note, do tickle that algorithm with a like and a sub, and do subscribe to Third Eye Drops on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts, as we've got over 300 audio-only pods that will never be published here on YouTube. And if you want to both support these transmissions and join the community, participate in the Third Eye Drops Wonder Lodge, go to patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. You can get in on live Zoom hangs. You can get into our patron-only Discord, get physical rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. And with that, my fellow sentient sacks of stardust, let's meld minds with the wise, wonderful Dr. Will Cole. Very excited to mine your expertise. I myself come from this conversation, I think, from a more like psycho-spiritual stance a lot of the time, but I'm highly interested in all aspects of health, all aspects of mental well-being. And I love that in this new book in particular, it seems like you're really trying to marry the two. Like you talk a lot about, you really draw attention to the fact that these things that we conceive of as separate, like the physical, the mental, the spiritual, the daily activities, there's really not a division there. And for the most part, that's an illusion. And it seems like you do a tremendous job of reminding people of that in this new book. And I really love that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's such a very integral part to my work at the telehealth center. So my day job is looking at labs, and been in telehealth for the past 13 years and looking at things like autoimmune problems and inflammation, other types of inflammation issues, metabolic issues, brain health issues, hormonal problems. So you really can't look at those issues and ignore if you're going to really be comprehensive and look at the variables that are at play, you can't ignore the mental, emotional, spiritual side of it all. So, yeah, these are things, bits of conversations that I've had in previous books. But I really was like, okay, if I'm going to write another book, it has to be about this because it's such a central part of my work. And that's why I called it Gut Feelings. Like, well, on a surface level, that phrase, right? Gut feelings, gut instincts. I just feel it in my gut. I have butterflies in my stomach. Somehow our ancestors knew
Yeah.
that our soul, our seed, the gut was the seat of the soul, that we somehow had this intuition, this sort of knowingness that was somehow in that part of our body, right? On some level. And is at least correlated to that part of the body.
Yeah.
And that is, and now science is catching up with antiquity, that we have randomized controlled trials, and we know the mechanisms of action as far as the scientific literature is concerned, of how the gut is connected to the brain, and we cannot separate mental health from physical health, and how people can eat super clean, take the right supplements, do all the wellnessy stuff on a physiological level. But these concepts that I'm talking about in the book, like unresolved trauma and chronic stress and something that I call shameflammation, how are these things impacting our biochemistry? Because they're influencing our biochemistry just as much as food, just as much as some micronutrient that you may be supplementing with. So it's so important when you're dealing with autoimmunity and these metabolic and hormonal problems. It's huge when it comes to getting people beyond that plateau that they're stuck at.
Yeah. Yeah. Not only are the borders blurry, I think there's really a commingling of all of these alchemical substances that we, for whatever reason, think of as separate or distinct. Like, even just bodily intelligence, we somehow have relegated to like above the eyeballs. But everybody knows it's like you feel things in your gut. You feel things in your throat, in your vagus nerve. There are these kinds of knowing that we're feeling all the time, but we've lost the fluency with those kinds of feelings, and we've lost the language of what those types of knowing can tell us about ourselves, our nervous system. Um, and there are so many practices and things you can do to get more in tune with that. I'm personally a huge advocate of ice baths, of cold exposure in general. That's been a big part of my personal practice. But what are some of the ways that you help people reconnect with these sort of, like, I don't know, exiled kinds of intelligences, it seems like, in
Yeah.
their bodies?
Yeah. And so much of it is like, it's like you said, I like the way that you said it, lost to fluency, or this sort of massive, I think, remembering that people can have. And science is really showing, all right, things that now we know that, mechanisms and the pathways, and we know the specific how it's happening. But our ancestors didn't have the randomized controlled trials. They just saw anecdotally it worked when people did something, did whatever practice you're talking about, it produced this result generally. And I mean, most of the things I'm talking about in the book they're all backed by science, but most of them were ancient practices,
Yeah.
or not even practices. Like, for example, I talk about Shinrin Yoku in the book, like the research out of Japan and South Korea, where we have like the Japanese phrase of Shinrin Yoku is translated to English as forest bathing, which sounds funny to the person that's not, they think, oh, that's, you people in wellness are so freaking weird and and have weird names for things, but it's really a beautiful description, I think, of what the Japanese are talking about. It's not just going on a hike, but it's sensorially taking in nature with all of your senses, using nature as a medicine and a meditation. So, like, our ancestors didn't, they just called that life. Like,
Right.
right, but we have a name for it and we know the mechanisms of it. So, I mean, there's so many practices. I talk about ice bath, cold plunges and ice baths in the book, because of, it's a great way to support your parasympathetic nervous system, to strengthen that vagus nerve that you talked about earlier. A lot of what I'm talking about in the book are different ways that, both from a physiological and a psychological standpoint, how can you tone that vagus nerve? Because many people when we talk about a dysregulated nervous system, what we're talking about is, in short, a poor or weak vagal tone, where that master regulator of that resting, digesting, hormone balanced state, it's weak, and we need to tone it. And cold plunges is a way to do that. But I mean, again, our ancestors would have just swam in cold water as a
Right.
way to strengthen that. So we were living life in harmony with how we evolved. And that's what a lot of what researchers are looking at is this evolutionary mismatch, that the majority of our genetics haven't changed in 10,000 years, but yet the way we're doing life is out of alignment with that. So there's this chasm between our DNA, which hasn't changed in 10,000 years predominantly, and the world around us, or epigenetics, our environment. So it's the things we're exposed to or not exposed to. It's the foods we're eating or not eating. It's environmental toxins. It's our relationship with technology. All of these things are triggering genetic predispositions that have been there for 10,000 years, but are being awoken and triggered like never before in human history because of this epigenetic genetic mismatch. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but things like cold plunges and breath work and forest bathing and somatic practices, oftentimes we have names for them today, but really they're just ways to live more primally, more ancestrally.
Yeah. Well, it did something better than answer my question. It stoked more wonder and kind of a little bit of a synchronicity, because just before this, I was working on a video on that I'm just generally calling the epidemic of soul sickness. And I'm sure I'm not the first person to call it that. But I was talking about precisely what you're hinting at, in that it seems like we're living in a time where we have more connection, more knowledge, more medicine, more of everything. But what that leads to is this temperate beige ease that's putting us more and more out of touch with the things that really matter and really promote health and really promote spiritual connection. And those things are nature. Those things are like actually challenging physical practices that get us deeper into our body, connecting with like-minded people on a soulful level, having direct experiences with the transcendent. Like, these are all of the things, and I mean, that's just to name a few. There are many more. But these are the things we've lost fluency with at the expense of this newer kind of
Mm-hmm.
shallow connection. And I would imagine for you, in all of these hundreds or thousands of people you've treated over the years, that you come across people where you think, "Ah, the first kind of intervention this person needs is probably not medicinal in the way they think it is. It's
Mm-hmm.
probably something like they need to slow down, they need to reconnect." How do you get people to actually do that and take it seriously when they might not understand the power of something like that, in terms of just allowing their body to recalibrate, to heal,
Mm-hmm.
like down regulate the nervous system, the
Mm-hmm.
sympathetic nervous system? Like, how do you actually get people to do it, and what are the some of the things you ask people to do?
Mm-hmm. So it all starts with my job, my running the telehealth clinic. When I'm having an initial consultation online with somebody, it is holding space for them, right? It's getting
Yeah.
to know the resonance of who they are and way they speak, the space in between the words. Like, you just kind of feel that person's resonance, even online. And it's the science and the art of what I do. And like the science is getting the right data information point, like looking at their health history thoroughly and looking at their childhood, like adverse childhood experience
Yeah.
score, looking at their gut health and their past labs and their blood labs and all this stuff. That all this stuff has to be done, right? But the art of it is the resonance. It's the space in between the words. It's kind of knowing their language that they speak, and I mean like emotional language, like their love language in a way. Like what is the way that you can meet them where they're at and educate them and empower them in a way that they're even going to receive that information.
Yeah.
So yeah, sometimes that cliche of a square peg through a round hole, like you cannot make someone do something they're not ready to do. And I'll give you an example. Like I've talked to somebody a few weeks ago, and they had a lot of things going on physiologically. They had high ACE score as well, so a lot of childhood trauma, and as with many people, they kind of gaslight themselves and say, well, it wasn't that bad. You know, it was the time. And, you know, my parents did the best they could. All this stuff may be true, right? But it doesn't mean that it wasn't impacting her health today. And she was kind of defensive and move along, move along. There's nothing to see here. And, you know, you have to respect that. She was expecting the functional medicine guy to give her a protocol to follow as far as like foods to focus on, foods to avoid. Here's supplement protocol. Here's some biohacking things to do, which we did all that stuff. And for her, the in was like the entry point or the next level of her healing because she'd already done some stuff with nutrition in the past. But her next level with us and what she was ready to cross was that stuff that I just talked about. But 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, which I thought it would be longer. Normally it's actually longer, but I think this is the power of, well, whatever you're in is implanting seeds.
Mm-hmm.
And for her, it was like, okay, as we got inflammation levels lowered by supporting her gut health and working on the gut brain axis and really regulating her hormones, she physiologically, physically had more bandwidth and resilience, and her head was enough above that proverbial water that she could actually handle that stuff. So she actually said to me, hey, that childhood trauma stuff that you were talking to me about a month ago, like, I'm ready to go there. And we coordinated with EMDR and somatic practices with the clinic, and she was ready to deal with that and like the next level of her health. So I think that it's all about knowing where the person's at, seeing what they're ready to cross, and kind of ebbing and flowing and like being flexible with how you meet the person where they're at. Because if you make that person say, no, like this is the only way to do it, you have to do all the things at once, you're going to burn them out. It's going to be unsustainable. It's going to be such a source of dread. And that same truth is applicable on the physiological side. So if you know there's a nutritional intervention that would be the most optimal for them, but they have a lot of overwhelm and anxiety and resistance about the whole process, you have to go to plan B and meet the person where they're at on a nutritional level. And plan B ends up being plan A if plan B is a more source of joy and realistic and sustainable for them. Because as I talk about in the book, like that the subtitle is this healing the shame-filled relationship between what you eat and how you feel. So if somebody has shame and obsession and negativity around the food, even if food makes the most sense for them to eat, it's going to be an underlying saboteur to achieving their goal. Like the headspace and heart space in which you do the wellness thing, whether it's food or something else, will be a factor, a variable, an ingredient into the result that you're looking for.
Yeah, totally. I'm a bit of an enthusiast of the discipline of positive psychology and the extent to which you can achieve an overriding sense of positive affect has such a gigantic impact on, again, not just your mental health, but your physical health in a way that I think a few years ago people would have accused you of like being a woo peddler for saying. But now there's not only clinical trials, but there's actual what's the terminology? It's slipping my mind. Where you look at an overview of numerous studies on
meta-analysis.
Meta-analysis
Yeah.
of positive affect, and you see how much it lowers all cause mortality and cardiovascular events. So I think we're just beginning to understand what you're talking about, but there's already just copious amounts of evidence pointing to the fact that the relationship between mind and body is not only real, between like emotion and health is not only real, but it's something we probably need to take deathly seriously, like now. And like I think where it like starts to make sense for people, probably because it's been in the zeitgeist longer, is maybe just talking about stress or something. But even something like stress feels somewhat, nebulous. Like what is this stress?
Mm-hmm.
And that leads me to another question for you, which is how do you begin to make some of those nebulous emotional things more like qualitatively something that you can make them understand and make them realize the urgency of dealing with it, and how it's directly impacting their health, like something like shame, for instance, that you talk about in the book. Like there's research to suggest that shame has a really terrible overall effect on your health. But how do you actually get someone to me, that's one of those things I always deal with, is like getting over the hurdle of something being conceptual versus something you can actually act upon.
I think that labs and
Mm,
are helpful because you can kind of show people on paper, okay, look, studies show, and this isn't just some abstract concept of like a study or whatever, some doctor pontificating about something. This is actually, I see, let's, for example, like, my thyroid hormones are negatively impacted. I have higher inflammation levels. And you show them, all right, this is how you feel. These are your symptoms. These are your labs. And these are the components to the variables as to things that can be contributing to this, how you feel and what the labs are saying. I think that that's like aha moment for many people. I think that, beyond labs, just from a subdiagnostic standpoint, questionnaires can be insightful. Like, for example, we ask a lot of questions when we're initially having the telehealth consult before they meet us. They're filling out paperwork. The amount of aha moments I hear from that is like pretty amazing. And I adapted a lot of those questionnaires that we have for patients on quizzes, and like formatted it for the general public. They could take the quizzes for free. They're at drwillcole.com. That they're just adapted from questions that I ask patients, and I made them because there were so many aha moments over 13 years where people were like, "Oh man, I didn't realize that this. I thought this was normal, but it wasn't normal. Like I didn't realize that this background anxiety or this like I'm craving this type of thing or whatever obscure thing that helps us create patterns to know what labs are appropriate and understand the case a little bit more thoroughly. So I think that those and what's the commonality then? It's like whether it's a questionnaire, a quiz, or it's a lab. It's growing awareness and a connection to your body, because so many people are disconnected from their body,
mhm.
and our culture is so steeped in distracting and numbing
Yeah.
that they think just because something's common, they equate that with being normal, and just because something's their everyday doesn't mean they should settle for it. So I think that that's a big thing, and then they can start looking at, okay, this stressful job, it may be my everyday, but is it really normal? Like, is this toxic relationship, is it really good for my health? It's just raising awareness. It's mindful awareness. It's using questionnaires and labs and data to raise awareness.
Yeah, that makes total sense. This point that you've brought up about how the body holds on to stress, even and trauma, even old trauma, is something that's really interesting to me. And I don't know how much is known technically about that, or how you think about that physiologically. I know in the book we've already touched on like the vagus nerve, which seems like it could be have a role to play in that and the expression of that, or maybe holding on to that. Maybe the enteric nervous system, which you also bring up, this sort of like neuronally dense pathway between in the gastrointestinal tract. Like how do you think about that, or do you not try to get overly physical with that?
No, it's important. It's the physiological impact that these things have on the body. It's really the heart of what I look at from a diagnostic standpoint. So the gut and brain are formed from the same fetal tissue. So it starts when babies are
Mm,
growing in their mother's womb, it's inextricably linked, the gut and the brain, for the rest of our life through what's known as the gut-brain axis, or the connection between the gut and the brain. But there's just so many connections here. I mean, 95% of serotonin is made in the gut.
yeah.
50% of dopamine is made in the gut. So our pleasure, happy neurotransmitters predominantly are made in the gut. They work upon the vagus nerve. They don't pass through the blood-brain barrier, the ones that are made in the gut, but they cross communicate, cross talk with the brain through the vagus nerve. So this sort of the largest cranial nerve in the body that is in part responsible for that communication between the gut and the brain, and the brain and the gut, is dysfunctional in many people, and we have to look at the role that these mental, emotional, spiritual things are playing in our body, because we know the body is basically a cellular library,
Yeah.
and Our thoughts, our words, our emotions, our experiences are cumulatively the books that fill up that library. And it's abstract, it is complex, it's not cut and dried, but we have to look at these variables like our current stress, unresolved trauma, and what role is it playing. It's a component. For some people, it's a massive component. For some people, it's just a smaller component. For some people, they have very low ACE scores. Like, they had a great childhood. They have no current stress. Like, those unicorns do exist. And for them, it's mainly physiological. Like, mainly it's like some nutrient deficiencies, foods that don't love them back. Maybe it's environmental toxins they have to deal with. Maybe it's a mold toxin or chronic Lyme disease. It's something that happened in their life, but as they're not stressed out currently, they had very low ACE scores. So it's not a factor for everybody, but chronic stress and shame and things that drive shame, like unresolved trauma, are an ingredient for many people and need to be given the same attention that you would give to your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that's why I call them metaphysical meals in the book. Like, what are we serving our head and our heart throughout the day? These ruminating thoughts, these like junk food snacks that we're giving our body throughout the day that's influencing our biochemistry just as much as the food. So we have to start retraining our brain, our nervous system to break these junk food thought cycles.
Yeah, no question. When you're looking at information in a blood panel, and you're looking at hormone levels and stuff like that, are there things that tie directly into that vagal health? Or that's something I don't know a lot about, but I'm aware of the important role of the vagus nerve and everything that we've just talked about and more. But what do you look at physiologically that would lead you to suspect that there's an issue there?
Well, it really, a lot of it has to do with the neuroimmunoendocrine axis. So it's like
Mhm.
a big thing, but it's like the intersection between the nervous system, the immune system, and the endocrine system. So how you would quantify a lot of those things indirectly mostly, is through labs like chronic inflammation tests are one. You would look at things like high sensitivity C-reactive protein. You would look at a lot of gut-centric immune markers like calprotectin, which can be high in some people, more people that have autoimmune issues like inflammatory GI issues like Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, and many IBS cases that aren't autoimmune per se, but they're somewhere on that inflammation spectrum. So I think looking at inflammation levels as far as the immune system of the neuroimmunoendocrine axis would be one way to look at it. I think that looking at for some people, this is a small subset of people. This is not everybody. You can measure actual antibodies and immune system activity against the nervous system. So that's not everybody, but certainly people that are further down on the autoimmune inflammation spectrum, you can measure antibodies to nervous system tissue. One inflammation marker that is higher in people with autoimmunity, but it can be high in a lot of other people too, more commonly, is homocysteine. Actually, homocysteine is an inflammatory protein. It's very conventionally ran. It's normally ran from like assessing cardiovascular risk factors like heart attack and stroke. In the optimal range, the functional range, where the body's functioning the best, that's where we get our name in functional medicine. And the labs reference range is based, like all reference ranges basically, are based on a statistical bell curve average of people who go to labs. And people that go to labs, sadly, aren't the people, they're going through some stuff, which is why they're going to the labs. So just because something's average doesn't mean it's optimal. So we're looking at optimal, not average, the optimal functional range, not just the labs reference range, which can catch the gray areas. And many people fall through the cracks of the sort of standard model of care because they're looking at the black and the white and not the gray in between, where you can be symptomatic but not diagnosable by the mainstream criteria. So anyways, homocysteine, we see slightly elevated to pretty high extreme levels of homocysteine levels that we know acts as a neurotoxin. The body's not degrading it. It's not methylating homocysteine down into methionine. And it's contributing to neuroinflammation, which is impacting the vagus nerve and the nervous system at large. And then the last part of the neuroimmunoendocrine axis are hormones. So one of the most common, like circadian rhythms you can see that off is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or what everybody talks about is adrenal fatigue, quote unquote. But it's a brain-based issue. It's actually a neuroendocrine issue, not an adrenal gland issue. It's different than Addison's disease, which is autoimmune adrenal disease. It's just something different. But it's the communication between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So you can see cortisol high when it should be low, or it's low when it should be high, or it's always high, or it's always low in like cases like chronic fatigue syndrome. So it's some dysregulation of this neuroendocrine communication line. So that's really what you look at. Is all of those things I just mentioned are all associated in the scientific literature with poor vagal tone. So that's how we assess it.
That's fascinating. You also brought up another thing that I've long been fascinated by, which it kind of has a reputation for being this vexing, mysterious thing where the body starts to attack itself, what we popularly call autoimmune disorders. What do you think is underpinning the majority of those, and how do you approach those? And does your approach differ from the mainstream approach? What's your philosophy there?
Yeah, so it's poor vagal tone is associated with different autoimmune issues. So that's all the things I mentioned earlier are definitely relevant to someone understanding the variables to autoimmunity. So science recognizes about 100 different autoimmune diseases today. The most common ones are rheumatoid arthritis, Hashimoto's or autoimmune thyroiditis, Sjogren's, lupus, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's, celiac disease. Those are the most common ones. MS would be another pretty common one. So those are the diagnosable ones. But researchers estimate that 4 to 10 years prior to that diagnosis, things were brewing on that autoimmune inflammation spectrum, meaning for most people, it didn't happen overnight. And there could be some tipping point. It could be some straw that broke the camel's back for somebody where it triggers that genetic predisposition. Because the researchers estimate that it's about a third of that puzzle is genetics. So there's some maybe methylation gene variant or HLA gene variant that we see a lot, some combination of gene variants that can trigger that genetic predisposition. But so a third of this autoimmune puzzle is genetics. It's estimated for most people. So there's different methylation gene variants, different HLA gene variants, which impacts how your body's handling stressors and environmental toxins and inflammation levels as a whole. But 2/3 is epigenetics. So it's something that triggered that 1/3, some environmental factor that triggered the genetics. The 2/3, the epigenetic, triggered the 1/3 genetics. For most people, there's exceptions to what I just said, but that's what researchers are really looking at, that interplay between genetics and epigenetics. And the old thought was that genetics was, the predestination, that you had no agency over your health, that if your mom had it or your dad had it, you were predestined. But now we know that's really not the entire story. That it is like the analogy that's used is genetics is the loading the gun, but epigenetics pulls the trigger. And there's something in our life, whether it's stress or trauma or a virus or environmental toxin or underlying gut problem, something hit the tipping point that allowed that genetic expression to come to play. So diagnostically, in functional medicine, we're looking at those things. Instead of saying, well, we don't know why you got this, and there's really nothing you can do about this, but maybe take this steroid, maybe take this immunosuppressant. Right. This is your lot in life. The best you can do is just, quote unquote, manage flare-ups. In most cases, we see the opposite clinically. There's a lot of agency we wield when we understand the 1/3 and we do something about the 2/3. So the analogy like I use for patients is when it's the bucket analogy. Some people have big buckets, some people have smaller buckets. That's your genetic tolerance for stressors. That's the 1/3. We can't change our bucket size, but we can change what we put in the bucket. So environmental toxins and unresolved trauma and foods that don't love us back and whatever case, whatever stressor, physiological, psychological stressor it is, we have a lot of agency to empty that bucket so we can calm down the intensity and the frequency of flare-ups and allow the immune system. And something that I talk about in Gut Feelings is researchers refer to, and this is what happens on a physiological level, when the immune system loses recognition of self. When there's something called molecular mimicry, when the immune system is attacking, let's say, the thyroid in Hashimoto's disease, or the myelin sheath for MS, or the hair for alopecia, or the skin for vitiligo. I mean, there's so many different autoimmune issues. When the immune system loses recognition of self, that's when the body attacks itself. But then I think, okay, that's happening on a physiological level, but how much of this is also from a mental, emotional, spiritual,
Yeah.
losing recognition of self,
Yeah.
and even humanity losing recognition of self and remembering where we came from to decrease that chasm between genetics and epigenetics. So that's kind of our perspective on it. And part two of that is, yes, it's very different than the conventional understanding of autoimmunity. But the reality is it's not anti-science. It is what the researchers are looking at. We're just applying it in people's lives today.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good loop back around, I think, into that the underlying sort of psycho-spiritual malaise that could be driving the physical manifestation of what you see happening. Because it seems like so are you familiar with Dr. Lisa Miller at all? She's a psychologist
Yes.
from
Yep.
Columbia. She has an
Mm-hmm.
awesome book called The Awakened Brain, and she talks all about in that book how people with a deep spiritual purpose in life, it's not that they're not tasked with what looks like a great duty or stress from the outside looking in. It's the fact that they feel connected with some sort of deep why behind everything they're doing. It's like that famous Viktor Frankl quote that I probably won't get right, that it's like he who has a why can endure something about you can endure anything as long as you have a why. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like in a lot of the stress that we have in a modern sense, and I know I lived through this in a previous career, you just feel like not only like you're being confronted with this tsunami of bullshit and obligation, but you just don't care. There's a deep sense of like, I don't really fucking care about this. And I feel trapped between a wall of like endless obligation and not caring. And then you just start to, your body just starts to, and your mind starts to almost rebel against that. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know if this is ringing a bell with what you come across a lot in your own practice, but I have to imagine that there's a lot of people that you're like, this person's in a toxic relationship. This person's in a toxic job. This person's got a toxic family members. And then like how do you approach those situations, Will? Because it's like that, it's like they're ready to hear maybe like
Mm-hmm.
what you're saying, like, oh, this level's off. You got to change your diet. You got to take this drug maybe. But if you say you got to cut this person loose, I mean, do you go there?
Oh, we go there. Yeah, we go
Mhm.
there. Yeah, but normally it doesn't happen early on, right? It's like it's. I talk about something in the book how Eckhart Tolle kind of boils it down to change, leave, or accept.
Mm.
And we have to, whether it's a job or a friendship or a family member or a partner, spouse, we apply a lot of that change, leave, or accept. Like, can we change it? Can we get them in therapy, or can we talk to the boss and say this schedule's unsustainable for my health? Can we change it? Or can we accept it? Sometimes it's the job that we can't. It's not realistic at this point in their life for them to leave it, but they have to really work on radical acceptance and sort of this deep inner non-resistance that brings about that peace that passes all understanding, as the Bible says it, which is possible. I see people up against really seemingly not unacceptable situations find a deep acceptance for their health and for their life. But sometimes they really can't change it and they can't accept it, so they have to leave it. So I've seen people leave jobs for their health. I've seen people leave marriages for their health. So yeah, that's a bridge that we're ready to cross with them when and if they need to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, speaking personally, again, I mentioned a previous career. I was starting to uh, I was dealing with a lot of another thing you touch on in the book at some point is the role between anxiety and insomnia. And I was starting to get these spikes of almost nonsensical dread and stress in the middle of the night. And then, again, as you point out in the book, then that starts to interrupt incredibly important hormonal cycles in the body, like production of melatonin. It disrupts your quality of sleep, which then actually has a direct um, impact on how well you're able to cope with stress. And there was a really interesting fact in the book that I'm going to try to conjure up, which was something to the effect of like, if you don't get enough REM sleep, you actually are going to have a more negative view of the things that have happened to you, because there's some kind of positivity bias that occurs in REM sleep. So it actually will exacerbate your stress and exacerbate your outlook toward the negative if you don't get enough sleep. So I was just in this vicious cycle of not being able to sleep, getting stressed out, waking up in the middle of the night. And that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back for me, where I was like, you know what? I'm young enough. I don't have kids. So I can't do this anymore. I'm just not going to do this anymore.
Mhm.
But yeah, to your point, some people are not in that position.
No, yeah, I mean, you can't. You have to kind of see what's realistic, and that's going back to that concept of science and art. Sometimes you have to be pragmatic. Like we see a lot of shift workers, for example,
Yeah.
and they work. The nurses that do night turns, or truck drivers, or postal service, whatever, factory workers, that they will work these crazy shifts, and most of them can't change that at least in this foreseeable future. At this season of their life, they're going to have to be there. Is it the most conducive to their circadian rhythm? No, it's not. And there's a lot of researchers on shift workers and the impact that it could have on their sleep wake cycle, on their hormones, and on inflammation levels and their metabolic health. But so we have to be in an inner, probably that's just the goal, to be in a state of inner acceptance to it, because they really can't change it right now. They can't really leave it right now. So how can we be in acceptance to this not ideal situation? And what are the things we do have agency over? Like there's a lot of things that you do have some governance over, as far as the foods you're eating and your these mind body practices we can lean into to make the best of a non-ideal situation. Most people don't have ideal situations, and we can get them feeling freaking amazing. So I'm used to the pragmatic, and that's what we have to roll with. But sometimes they get to the point where that, look, I've uncovered all these stones. I'm a lot better than I once was, but this thing at this point in my life is really out of alignment, and I can leave it. And I think that's a brave decision. That's not always easy. When you're talking about a marriage of X amount of years, or a career that pays really well, these are big decisions that I've seen people make for the sake of their health and their life. We only have one go in this lifetime, at least this time, that people want to have this brief, even the longest living of us, it's so brief here on earth. Like how are we going to make it? And people have to make brave decisions sometimes with a lot of uncertainty for the sake of their health. And I see people that lose a lot of money because they leave that job,
Yeah.
or a lot of uncertainty leaving that relationship, but the healthiest and happiest they've ever been, because that shackles of that shame and stress and anxiety and dread isn't in their life anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, and full disclosure, man, I'm one of those people. I left this job like about 5 or 6 months ago now to do this and related things full time. And although there's obvious stress that comes with this, and I'm in this building phase when it comes to this, it makes all the difference, man. It's like fighting a war that you care about, that you're a general in, versus being just like a frontline drone, just like throwing your body on the line for a cause you don't believe in or something. Like that's really that's how big of a difference
Yeah,
it
yeah.
is. And man, just before that thought, I had something else that just slipped my mind. I'm going to try to get it back. What were you talking about? You're talking about,
Uh,
oh, I know. So if you do come across these people who work third shift, and they're not only out of sync with a normal sleep schedule, they're out of sync with naturalness to a huge degree, because they're not getting sunlight. They're not getting like the wavelengths of light that that trigger a lot of circadian rhythms and have cascading hormonal effects, et cetera, et cetera. Do you go into things like light therapy? Are there things that you recommend that everybody who's a third shift worker tries to do if they're forced to work in that kind of a schedule?
Yeah, yeah. If they have access to it and the budget to do so, red light therapy can be wonderful. Full spectrum light therapy can be great. They have desk. If they have a desk in an office, we can get just single panel like office desk units that can be really helpful. If at home they are I get them the red light panels to be helpful. If yeah, so and also going out and being intentional, going out on their breaks. Like if they are any chance they get to go outside and get proper sleep. We track on all the data points like the bands and the rings and the watches. We track that when on the night turn days and on the off days. And we optimize it as best as we can. And getting proper sunlight, getting proper light, even if it's artificial light that's mimicking daylight, is helpful. So yeah, it's part of their tools within the toolbox for sure.
Yeah, and even I'm sure you can relate to this as well because we're both in a sort of northern climate where
Mm-hmm.
there can be some pretty
Yeah.
shitty dark stretches during the winter. And I got this small Juve red light at a
Mm-hmm.
conference I went to years ago, and I just blast that thing all over my face in the morning during the winter. Do you have any like specific? I mean, I don't know. You could be affiliated with a company. I don't know, but do you have any specific things that you look for in a red light? Are there certain wavelengths that you recommend,
Yeah.
or
Yeah. I mean, Juve is great. I think a lot of our patients like Juve. Um, True Dark, True Light, I think is the names of Dave Asprey's company too, that they have some red light therapy. Sauna Space has the I actually have that one for my desk, which is like a incandescent full spectrum light. That's a just a desk unit. Sunlighten has a lot of great options for people as far as sauna therapy that I love. Higher dose, these aren't all lights, but these are just like heat sometimes in sauna.
Mhm.
Um, that higher dose has some great options in that category. And something I was going to say too, from people that are inside a lot, PEMF I've seen be a game changer for
Mm.
people. It sort of mimics grounding and some of the research around forest bathing, Shinrin Yoku. And the higher dose has an amazing PEMF, which is pulsed electromagnetic frequencies. It kind of mimicking some of the frequencies of nature and the earth. That can be very supportive of this parasympathetic resting calming grounding mechanisms, and they pair it with infrared heat as well, which is quite calming and grounding too. So yeah, those are some brands that I'm friendly with, and they're doing innovative things in the space.
Nice. You mentioned, I have to imagine too, your own practice has transformed in the last few years because of what you just mentioned with wearables and the amount of data you can get off of wearables. Are there, my question though is, are they reliable? And and are there certain ones that, I mean, I don't know if you do or don't want to throw any under the bus, or if you do or don't want to um, extol the virtues of any in particular. But if people are thinking about getting a wearable, are there ones that you recommend?
Yeah, I've done a lot of research on the main ones that are out there, and there's probably a lot more that I'm not aware of. But like a Whoop Band, Aura Ring, the two ones that we use the most, Aura Ring the most clinically, I think they're great. And I have patients that we've tested of tracking Apple Watch, Whoop Band, and Aura Ring, and pretty much the data, the overlapping data, they all test slightly for different things. But for the most part, especially the Aura Ring and the Whoop Band, the data for the people that we've tested are pretty much the same.
Mm,
So between the devices, so it depends. It's really preference, I think, on like what you prefer. A lot of times, like, oh yeah, I prefer the band or I prefer the ring. And if they're interested in learning about their own, feedback, their own bio individuality of how things like stress and sleep and food how does that impact their life? And also for sleep specifically, how does food and stress impact and physical activity impact my sleep scores? And looking at REM and deep sleep and optimizing it. And it's one of the things we use beyond labs, just from a day-to-day tracking. What does that look like? CGMs would be the other category that we use a lot clinically for patients, is a continuous glucose monitor. Again, all wearable app-based devices that we can look at how does stress and food and sleep impact blood sugar and glucose control. So, and we've tracked multiple devices with that too, and they're pretty much the same. Like Levels and NutriSense are the two main ones. They're both doing great things. We work with Levels more, but if a patient has a preference, we'll roll with whatever they want to do. Yeah, so they're great. Does everybody need them? No. More data isn't always better. I'll be honest, for myself, I've used them all for a time to use it as a mindfulness awareness of like how these things impact me.
Yeah.
But I like keeping it simple, and I don't use any of them on a day-to-day basis. I use them when I check in with myself, or if I'm going through something, what is my body telling me, and then drop it and leave it and keep it simple. I like just being more intuitive and using them as little N of one experiments, but then dropping it. Because I do feel like you can get diminishing returns sometimes when you get so obsessive and
Oh yeah.
about it. It's like, I don't want to know every minute of the day for everything. Some people do. Some people like have a massively like alpha biohacking mind, and more data is like they just love it. It's a source of joy and like fascination, and like it's a game for them. Then okay, then that's, if you're that type of person, then I'm not saying it's a bad thing. And then people are like, okay, well, EMFs, are they a problem? I've looked into the EMFs. It's just small amounts. These things have small amount of EMFs. We're exposed to way more other places than other. So I don't think that's a reason to not do it, because you're not even, most people, the way I recommend it for most patients, it is not, especially for a CGM. You're just wearing it for 3 to 4 weeks and then not wearing it anymore.
Yeah.
These are not type 1 diabetics who need to wear the CGM all the time. And the rings are only emitting EMFs whenever like they're syncing. You can put it on airplane mode. It's really infinitesimal.
Speaking of EMFs, I've heard a few people, intelligent people, talking about concern over things like AirPods recently because of the fact that they're inside your ears, and perhaps like there's EMFs, that are, I guess the idea is they're somehow interfering with your brain or doing something to your brain. Do you worry about that at all?
No, I don't.
Good.
Do
Good.
I wear them? No, I don't. I have these
Oh,
old school ones. You can see
yeah.
I don't, but it's really just a preference. It has nothing to do with EMF. So I've seen people say that. I haven't seen any compelling data to see that's an issue. I think it's kind of hyperbole and kind of fear mongering in that way until I see some data otherwise. And maybe it is. But I would say no. That's not a reason why I don't wear those things. Is because I would lose them. It's like purely practical. I see people like on planes like freaking out. Where the heck is my left ear pod? It's like, no, I just want this thing that I can plug in and plug out.
Yeah, yeah. I don't like them at all for podcasts. Anytime a guest has them on, I'm like, oh no, because
It's
that
not
like Bluetooth
not
audio is terrible
Yes,
at
but the
church.
audio's tinny,
Yeah.
and it can go out, and it's just not right on a practical sound level. It's not as good for podcasting too.
Yeah. Another angle I got to ask you about is supplementation. I like you actually don't really do much of a dalliance into the wearables, but I have a pretty, I think what most people would consider to be a pretty ridiculous stack of supplements I take pretty regularly. Are you a supplement guy? Do you see deficiencies in key areas often? And I would just love to hear you
Yeah,
generally riff on all of the above.
sure. Yeah, food is first. I don't think anybody of substance is going to deny that. I think you can't supplement your way out of a poor diet. I think I'd love to see from a clinical nutrition standpoint, and this is what we always do for patients, where can we fill in the gaps dramatically, even with our soil depletion and the lack of nutrients in our food? You can very much remedy a lot of it through breakfast, lunch, and dinner with focusing on nutrient density, bioavailable nutrient density, and improving gut health and digestion and absorption. Because remember, we aren't just what we eat and supplement with, we are what we absorb. And a lot of people, it's a gut health absorption issue that so many people have impaired digestion and absorption just on a functional level, like they're just suboptimal. So I think that over time, working on bioavailable nutrient density and improving digestion and absorption and gut health, you can fix a lot of stuff. But with that said, yes, I think like things like vitamin D can be advantageous for people depending on where you live and within reason. I think that focusing on all these micronutrients that can help with vitamin D and help with absorption of other things, because they're kind of cofactors to things, like looking at zinc and copper and selenium and iron and iodine and magnesium and these other electrolytes like potassium and sodium are hugely important. You can get a lot of that from food, but supplementation can be advantageous based on labs. Basically, I would look at data, and deficiencies can be remedied faster with supplementation. And methylated B vitamins, you can get them predominantly from food, but people that have mold toxins or underlying gut problems, and they need to overcompensate and kind of give their body more because their body is spending more than it's taking in from food alone. Things like methylfolate, methylcobalamin, or B12, other methylation supports can be helpful for people that have some methylation impairments, higher homocysteine levels, for example. And yeah, so that's another thing to consider. And if people are going through inflammation issues, there are different things like curcumin that can be very helpful with a lot of science behind it. CBD has its place, I think, for people that have higher inflammation levels. Food, you can focus on food and like cook with these spices to be supportive of that. But to get therapeutic dosages that have been researched to be advantageous to lower a certain inflammation biomarker, supplements can be helpful for a time. And so those are some things. Our patients are dealing with chronic health problems. Like when we're dealing with autoimmunity and things like SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or people who have histamine intolerance, or people that have brain fog, chronic fatigue syndrome, their supplement list is going to be a little bit top heavy. Like it's going to be a little bit more thorough, comprehensive, advanced for a time. But my goal is actually to edit that down and whittle it down to basically the essentials as time goes on. So I would just say, like, what are your needle movers? What can you get through food, and where can you fill in the gaps where food is not hitting a therapeutic threshold, where you're seeing benefits from it? That's where my mind would go. And part of, I lovingly call it a supplement graveyard, because I have people that are like taking all this stuff with the best of intentions. Like there's nothing nefarious about this list. It all in theory makes sense, right? But it's like more isn't always better. Not everything is necessarily a needle mover for them, and it could have some compelling research around it, but it's not necessarily the biggest needle mover for them. So part of my job when I'm talking to new telehealth patients is actually editing and like curating a list down to like what are the most impactful, the most worth your money and time. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but these are the things that we're always balancing between food and supplementation.
Yeah. Well, no, to an extent, it for sure does answer my question. There are two that I've specifically been hearing a lot about recently. One is just NAD boosters in general. I've been taking NMN for a while now. And the other, this one is just so strange how something comes into your awareness and then suddenly you just hear about it constantly. The other one is methylene blue. Do you have strong feelings on NAD boosters? They're not really related, but just two things that have been in my consciousness lately.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, they're getting a lot of notoriety and a lot of like people within the academic world talking about them, and in the podcast world talking about them. But I mean, NAD does drop as we age, right? So whether it's nicotinamide mononucleotide like NMN or nicotinamide riboside NR, both of those can be helpful. There are some studies that show that chronic use of these for some people that have genetic predispositions to certain cancers may not be the most advantageous to always supplement with these things. And they can deplete some other methylation support, some other B
Oh, really?
vitamins. So I think it's just if it's right for the individual and if you're monitoring other things, I think it can be helpful. I know some people that take those NAD precursors and it increases their energy levels. More isn't always better. I would, it's not the top of my list, I would say, to take. Is it very much touted by people that are interested in longevity and supporting longevity? Certainly it is. But, I would be more curious about other ways to increase NAD, which, cold plunges and
Yeah.
eating nutrient dense foods, like a lot of these things that increase these intracellular energy production has a positive effect on NAD or could have a positive effect on NAD levels endogenously. The methylene blue can be a tool for people that have detox issues. I see it used. We use it for people that have chronic Lyme disease, people have mold toxin issues to enhance detox. I've seen it be effective. Does everybody need to be on it? Certainly not, but it does have its place in certain protocols.
Yeah, I've been seeing it used more and more lately as a nootropic, as
Mm-hmm.
some, and I'm not sure what the vector for that is. I know it's purported to give you more mitochondrial
Yeah,
energy, and maybe that just gives you a feeling of increased energy. I'm
yeah,
not sure on that.
and that's how for the people that we typically would monitor the utilization of it. It is people that have mitochondrial dysfunction. They have markers of mitochondrial dysfunction, which I could see someone that's just looking for optimal, like neurotropic benefit or cognitive enhancement. They may see a benefit from that.
Yeah, I'm curious about it. I might give it a try. Have you tried it
Yeah,
personally?
I have. I didn't notice a major difference in it, but I used it intermittently. I didn't give it a consistent chance, but I wanted to test it. I test most things out on myself at least once.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're very much it makes sense. Like I think people put too much weight on supplementation, and especially when they don't have other elements of their life dialed in. It
Yeah,
totally makes sense that you would want to focus on those things first:
it
sleep,
is. Like
diet,
so
exercise.
I take adaptogens, I take medicinal mushrooms sometimes,
Yeah.
but it's more intuitive for me. It's like if I'm going through more of a stressful time or I'm feeling run down, then I up the medicinal mushrooms or adaptogens. But the core things are what I mentioned earlier. They're really basic things. And food is first, stress management is first, like really being mindful of sleep. That's major. Like these are things that are very low cost, practical things that the new sexy stuff that gets a lot of buzz is can be helpful for some people for a season of their life, certainly, but more isn't always better. And I think that goes back down to that sort of like a part of the reason why I wrote Gut Feelings is for that biohacking mind and for that wellness aficionado that's interested in this stuff. That it ends up like the good thing in theory ends up being a source of stress and obsession that is counterproductive. So it's kind of my thought on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like most experts I talk to echo everything you just said. So that totally makes sense. But hey man, I know I got you a little longer than what we were booked for. So we
Hey,
can
no, I
wrap this up.
appreciate it.
I really appreciate your time. It's been a lot of fun. You're a wealth of knowledge. And yeah, let's do it again sometime.
Yeah, thanks for having me.